He compared me to the neighbor's son, screamed at me for getting C's, and at 16 kicked me out of the house for being the family shame. I believed I just wasn't good enough. Until I found his old diary. The last entry turned everything upside down. Growing up in our small suburban house felt like walking on broken glass every single day. My father had this way of looking at me that made my stomach twist into knots. It wasn't just disappointment. It was something deeper, something that felt like pure disgust. When I brought home a B+ on a math test, other kids' parents would celebrate. Mine would slam the paper on the kitchen table and ask why it wasn't an A. When I made the JV basketball team as a sophomore, he didn't come to a single game. Instead, he'd mention how the kid next door was already varsity as a freshman. The house always felt cold, even in summer. Not temperature-wise, but emotionally. My mother tried to bridge the gap sometimes, making my favorite pancakes on Sunday mornings or slipping me $20 when I needed lunch money. But she never stood up to him. Never questioned why he treated me like I was some kind of burden he couldn't wait to get rid of. The worst part was how random his anger seemed. Some days I'd come home from school and he'd barely acknowledge me. Other days, the sound of my backpack hitting the floor would set him off into a rage about responsibility and how I'd never amount to anything. I remember one particular evening when I was 14. I'd actually had a good day, scored the winning goal in our soccer scrimmage, and got an A on a history paper I'd worked really hard on. I was excited to share the news, thinking maybe this time would be different. I found him in his study, hunched over some paperwork, and started telling him about my day. He didn't even look up, just kept writing whatever he was working on, and said I shouldn't expect praise for doing what I was supposed to do anyway. The deflation I felt was so complete, so crushing, that I went to my room and cried for an hour. By the time I turned 16, something had shifted in our dynamic. The cold indifference had turned into something more active, more hostile. He started finding fault with everything. The way I loaded the dishwasher, how I mowed the lawn, even how I walked through the house. It was like my very existence irritated him beyond measure. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in March. I'd stayed after school to work on a group project and got home around 6. Dinner was already over, and when I went to make myself a sandwich, he exploded. The things he said that night still echo in my head sometimes. How I was selfish and inconsiderate. How I showed no respect for the family or the house. How I was going nowhere in life and dragging everyone down with me. But the words that really cut deep were when he called me the family shame. Said I was an embarrassment and that he was tired of pretending otherwise. My mother stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face, but she didn't intervene. He told me to pack my things and figure out somewhere else to live because he was done with me. I spent that night at my best friend's house, and his parents were incredible. They didn't ask too many questions, just made up the couch and told me I could stay as long as I needed. Over the next few weeks, I bounced between friends' houses and sometimes slept in my car when I felt like I was wearing out my welcome. The guidance counselor at school helped me apply for financial aid and find a part-time job at a local grocery store. It was humiliating, being 16 and essentially homeless, but I was determined to prove my father wrong. The next few years were a blur of working, studying, and trying to build a life from nothing. I graduated high school with decent grades despite everything and managed to get into a state college with a partial scholarship. College was hard, not just academically, but emotionally. Watching other kids get care packages from home and having parents visit for weekend games made the hole in my chest feel even bigger. I worked in the dining hall to pay for meal plans and spent holidays on campus when the dorms stayed open for international students and kids like me who had nowhere else to go. After graduation, I moved across the country for work. I told myself it was for career opportunities, but really I just wanted to be as far away as possible from the place where I'd felt so unwanted. I built a decent life out there, found work I enjoyed, made friends, even dated seriously a few times. But there was always this underlying current of insecurity, this voice in my head that sounded exactly like my father telling me I wasn't good enough. Every promotion, every relationship milestone, every small success felt temporary, like someone was going to realize I was a fraud and take it all away. My mother and I kept in touch through emails and occasional phone calls. She'd update me on family news and local gossip, always carefully avoiding any mention of my father. I never asked about him directly, but sometimes I'd catch myself hoping she'd say he'd asked about me or express some regret about how things had ended. She never did. When I'd been gone for about 8 years, she mentioned in passing that he'd started having some health issues. Nothing serious, just the usual stuff that comes with getting older. Part of me felt like I should care more, but mostly I just felt numb about it. The call came on a Thursday morning in October. I was getting ready for work when my phone rang, and I almost didn't answer because I didn't recognize the number. It was a nurse from the hospital in my hometown. My father had suffered a massive heart attack and didn't make it. My mother had been too distraught to make the call herself, so she'd asked the hospital staff to contact me. The nurse was very kind, expressing condolences and asking about arrangements. I found myself responding on autopilot, saying I'd drive back for the funeral, but inside I felt completely hollow. The drive back home took 12 hours, and I had way too much time to think. I kept expecting to feel something: grief, anger, relief, anything. But there was just this strange emptiness. I pulled into my hometown as the sun was setting, and everything looked smaller than I remembered. The house where I'd grown up looked the same from the outside, maybe a little more worn around the edges. My mother met me at the door, and we hugged for a long time without saying much. She looked older, more fragile than I'd expected, and I realized how much time had really passed. The next few days were a strange mix of funeral preparations and awkward conversations with relatives I hadn't seen in years. Everyone kept telling me how sorry they were for my loss, and I kept nodding and thanking them while feeling like a complete fraud. How do you mourn someone who made your life miserable? How do you grieve a relationship that never really existed in the first place? The funeral itself was well attended. My father had been respected in the community, involved in local organizations, the kind of guy people thought of as a pillar of society. Listening to people talk about his kindness and generosity felt like they were describing a completely different person. After the service, my mother asked if I'd help her go through his things. She wasn't ready to tackle his study alone, and there were boxes of papers and files that needed to be sorted. I agreed, partly because I wanted to help her and partly because I was curious. This was the room where he'd spent most of his time, where he'd done his work and kept his private thoughts. Maybe I'd finally understand what had made him hate me so much. We worked in comfortable silence for the most part, sorting documents into piles, important papers to keep, old bills to shred, random stuff that could be thrown away. My mother handled the desk drawers while I tackled the bookshelf and filing cabinet. It was tedious work, but somehow therapeutic. As I worked my way through old tax returns and insurance policies, I started to build a picture of my father's life that I'd never seen before. He'd been meticulous about record-keeping, saving everything from utility bills to warranty information for appliances we'd replaced years ago. That's when I found the box hidden behind a row of old accounting textbooks. It was small, maybe the size of a shoebox, and surprisingly heavy. When I pulled it out, I could hear things shifting around inside. My mother was busy with something else, so I opened it without thinking much about it. Inside were things that made no sense at first: a child's baseball glove, some old photographs, a few small toys, and at the bottom, a leather-bound journal that looked like it had been handled a lot over the years. The photographs stopped me cold. They were pictures of a little boy who looked exactly like me at that age. Same dark hair, same eyes, same goofy smile I remembered having in my own childhood photos. But these weren't pictures of me. The clothes were different, older style, and in some of the photos there were people I didn't recognize. The baseball glove was tiny, sized for maybe a 6 or 7-year-old, and it was worn in a way that suggested it had been used a lot. One of the toys was a small red truck that looked familiar, but I couldn't place where I might have seen it before. I picked up the journal with hands that were starting to shake for reasons I couldn't explain. The leather was soft and worn, and when I opened it, I immediately recognized my father's handwriting. The first entry was dated about 25 years ago, just a few months before I was born. My heart started pounding as I read the first few lines, because nothing was making sense. He was writing about someone whose name had been carefully scratched out, but he referred to this person as his son. His first son, the son he'd lost. As I read further, the pieces started falling into place in the most horrible way possible. My father had been married before, to a woman who died in childbirth along with their son. No, that wasn't right. I kept reading, trying to understand the timeline. The woman had died, but the son had lived. The son who looked exactly like me in those photographs. The son who died in a car accident when he was 7 years old, just a few months before my parents got married. The journal entries from that time were raw with grief and guilt. My father blamed himself for the accident. He'd been driving, they'd been hit by a drunk driver, and somehow he'd survived while his son hadn't. The entries talked about how he couldn't bear to look at the photographs anymore, how he'd boxed everything up because the reminders were too painful. But then the entries started talking about my mother, about how she was helping him heal, about how maybe he could have a family again. Then I was born, and the entries changed completely. The first few were hopeful, talking about second chances and new beginnings. But as the months went on, the tone shifted. He started writing about how looking at me brought back all the pain he'd been trying to escape. How every milestone I reached reminded him of milestones his first son would never reach. How my laugh sounded exactly like the laugh he'd never hear again. But the entry that made my blood run cold was from when I was about 2 years old. He wrote about taking me to the same park where he used to take his first son, thinking maybe it would help him move forward. Instead, watching me play on the same equipment, in the same sandbox, had triggered something dark in him. He wrote about how unfair it felt that I got to grow up when his real son never would. How every day with me felt like a betrayal of the child he'd lost. The words on the page started to blur as I read about how he'd tried to love me, but couldn't separate me from his grief. How he knew it wasn't fair to me, but he couldn't help feeling like I was some kind of replacement that would never measure up. The entry that broke me completely was one from when I was 5, after I'd had a particularly good day at kindergarten and had been excited to tell him about it. He wrote about how my enthusiasm had made him physically sick because his first son would never have good days at school again. He wrote about how he wished it had been me in that car instead. I sat there on the floor of his study, surrounded by the detritus of his life, holding this journal that explained everything and nothing at the same time. My mother found me there an hour later, still clutching the book, tears streaming down my face. She took one look at what I was holding, and her face went completely white. She'd known. All these years, she'd known why he treated me the way he did, and she'd never said anything. Update 1. The confrontation with my mother was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. 25 years of confusion and pain came pouring out all at once, and for the first time in my life, I didn't hold back. I demanded to know how she could have watched him treat me like that, knowing the real reason behind it. How she could have let me grow up thinking I was fundamentally flawed when the truth was that I was being punished for something completely beyond my control. She broke down completely, sobbing in a way that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her chest. Through her tears, she told me things I'd never known about those early years. How my father had been suicidal after the accident. How she'd been terrified of pushing him too hard or saying the wrong thing because she was afraid he'd hurt himself. How she'd hoped that having me would help him heal, but instead it seemed to make everything worse. She said she tried to protect me as much as she could without directly confronting him about it, because she was afraid of what might happen if she did. But the revelation that hit me hardest was when she admitted that part of her had been relieved when he kicked me out. Not because she wanted me gone, but because she could see how much damage the situation was doing to both of us. She'd watched me become more and more withdrawn over the years, seen my confidence erode under his constant criticism, and she'd felt helpless to stop it. When I left, at least I had a chance to build a life away from his pain and anger. We talked through the night, and slowly a picture emerged of a family destroyed by grief in ways I'd never understood. My father hadn't been evil or abusive in the traditional sense. He'd been a broken man who'd never learned how to process his trauma in a healthy way. That didn't excuse what he'd done to me, but it helped explain it. My mother wasn't the weak woman I'd sometimes thought she was. She'd been trying to hold together a situation that was fundamentally unsustainable, protecting everyone as best she could while slowly falling apart herself. The next morning, I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of driving back across the country immediately, I decided to stay for a while. My mother needed help settling his affairs, but more than that, I needed time to process what I'd learned. I took leave from work and moved back into my childhood bedroom, sleeping in the same twin bed I'd had as a teenager. It felt surreal, being back in that house as an adult, but also strangely necessary. Over the following weeks, I continued going through my father's things, and I found more pieces of the puzzle. There were medical records showing he'd been prescribed medication for depression and anxiety multiple times over the years, but had stopped taking it because he said it made him feel numb. There were letters from therapists he'd apparently seen briefly, recommendations for grief counseling that he'd ignored. There was even a half-written letter to me from several years ago, where he'd tried to explain and apologize, but had apparently never finished or sent. But the discovery that changed everything was a sealed envelope tucked inside one of his old work files. It was addressed to me in his handwriting, with instructions that it should only be given to me after his death. My hands shook as I opened it, not sure I could handle any more revelations. Inside was a letter dated just 6 months earlier, apparently written during one of his hospital stays for what my mother had described as minor health issues. The letter was different from anything I'd ever seen from him. His handwriting was shakier than usual, and the words seemed to pour out in a stream of consciousness that was both rambling and painfully honest. He started by acknowledging that he'd been a terrible father, that he'd damaged me in ways that probably couldn't be repaired. But then he went on to tell me things about his first son that helped me understand why the comparisons had been so devastating. His first son had been everything to him, not just because he was his child, but because he'd been the light that pulled my father out of a dark period in his young adult life. The boy had been curious and affectionate, always asking questions and wanting to help with everything. My father had seen so much potential in him, had made so many plans for their future together. When the accident happened, it wasn't just a child he'd lost. It was his entire sense of purpose and hope for the future. Then I came along, looking so much like his lost son that it was like having a ghost in the house. Every time I smiled or laughed or showed excitement about something, it reminded him of moments with his first son that would never happen again. But worse than that, as I grew older and developed my own personality, the differences between me and his idealized memory of his first son became more apparent. I was more introverted where his first son had been outgoing. I struggled with math where his first son had been naturally gifted. I was interested in reading and quiet activities where his first son had loved sports and being active. In his grief-distorted thinking, these differences weren't just normal variations between children. They were proof that I was an inadequate replacement for what he'd lost. The letter revealed that he'd spent years trapped between two impossible emotions: guilt over treating me poorly, and resentment that I wasn't the child he'd lost. He wrote about how he'd known he was being unfair to me, but had felt powerless to change his feelings. The most heartbreaking part of the letter was near the end, where he tried to explain what had happened when he kicked me out. He'd reached a breaking point where he couldn't stand the daily reminder of his loss anymore, but he'd also realized that his presence in my life was toxic. In his twisted logic, forcing me to leave was almost an act of mercy, giving me a chance to become whoever I was supposed to be without the weight of his grief holding me down. He ended the letter by saying he was proud of what I'd accomplished despite everything he'd put me through. He'd apparently kept track of my life from a distance, and he knew about my college graduation, my job, the life I'd built for myself. He said that maybe his first son wouldn't have been as strong as I'd turned out to be, and that perhaps there was a reason things had happened the way they did. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was the closest thing to closure I was likely to get. Update 2. Reading that letter should have brought me peace, but instead it opened up a whole new set of questions and emotions I didn't know how to handle. I found myself grieving not just for the father I'd never had, but for the brother I'd never known existed. I started researching everything I could about this child who had shaped my entire life without me even knowing he'd existed. I found his birth certificate, school records from his brief time in kindergarten, even a few school photos that showed a gap-toothed grin that was eerily similar to my own childhood pictures. The strangest part was feeling jealous of a dead child. This little boy had experienced my father's love and pride for 7 whole years, something I'd never had even for a moment. He'd been wanted and celebrated and mourned, while I'd been tolerated at best and resented at worst. The rational part of my brain knew it wasn't his fault, knew that he was as much a victim of the situation as I was. But the emotional part of me struggled with anger at this ghost who had haunted my entire childhood. I started having dreams about him. Not nightmares exactly, but strange, vivid dreams where we were the same age and playing together. Sometimes in the dreams we were friends. Sometimes we were fighting over toys or our father's attention. I'd wake up feeling exhausted and confused, like I'd been trying to solve a puzzle in my sleep that had no solution. My mother noticed the change in me and suggested I might want to talk to someone about everything I'd discovered, but I wasn't ready for that yet. Instead, I threw myself into learning everything I could about grief and trauma and how they affect families. I read psychology books and articles online, trying to understand how someone could love one child so completely and then be unable to love another child who reminded them of that loss. The more I learned, the more I realized how common this actually was. Not the specific circumstances, but the general pattern of people being unable to move past traumatic loss in healthy ways. I also started visiting the cemetery where my father's first son was buried. It felt strange at first, paying respects to someone I'd never met, but who had influenced my entire life. The headstone was small and simple, just his name and dates, and the words "beloved son." There were often fresh flowers there, and I realized my father must have been visiting regularly all these years. It was one more piece of the puzzle, understanding that his grief had never really faded, had just been suppressed and redirected in unhealthy ways. But the real breakthrough came when I found a stack of old home videos in the back of a closet. They were on those old mini cassettes that required a special player to watch, and it took me a few days to find someone who still had the right equipment. When I finally watched them, I saw my father as I'd never seen him before, young and happy, and completely devoted to this little boy who looked so much like me. The videos were mostly mundane family moments, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, trips to the zoo. But what struck me was how different my father was with his first son. He was patient and playful, getting down on the floor to play with toys, reading bedtime stories with different voices for all the characters, teaching him to ride a bike with endless encouragement and enthusiasm. This was the father I'd always wanted, and seeing him like this was both wonderful and devastating. There was one video in particular that broke me completely. It was taken just a few weeks before the accident, and it showed my father and his son working together to build something with blocks. The little boy kept making mistakes and knocking things over, but instead of getting frustrated, my father would just laugh and help him start over. At one point, the boy looked directly at the camera and said he loved his daddy, and my father's face lit up with such pure joy that I had to pause the video and sit with the weight of that moment. That's when I understood that my father's treatment of me hadn't really been about me at all. I could have been the perfect child in every way, and it wouldn't have mattered because I wasn't the child he'd lost. The realization was simultaneously liberating and heartbreaking. Liberating because it meant all those years of trying to be good enough had been pointless. There was nothing I could have done differently. Heartbreaking because it meant I'd never really had a chance at having the father I'd needed. I made another decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I decided to have a memorial service for my father's first son. It seemed wrong that this child who had meant everything to my father had never been properly remembered or honored. I worked with my mother to plan something simple but meaningful, just family and a few close friends who had known them before the accident. The service was small and quiet, held at the same cemetery where both father and son were now buried. I spoke about discovering the existence of this brother I'd never known, about understanding how his life and death had shaped our entire family's story. I talked about how grief could twist love into something unrecognizable, and how important it was to remember not just the loss but the joy that had come before it. My mother spoke too, sharing memories of the little boy she'd known briefly before his death and before she'd married my father. She talked about how his laughter had filled their house, how he'd been curious about everything and kind to everyone. She said that in many ways, watching me grow up had been like seeing glimpses of who he might have become, and that maybe that's why the situation had been so painful for all of us. After the service, something shifted in me. For the first time in my life, I felt like I understood my place in my family's story. I wasn't a replacement or a consolation prize or a disappointment. I was just a different person who had been born into circumstances beyond anyone's control. My father's inability to love me the way I'd needed wasn't a reflection of my worth. It was a reflection of his unhealed trauma. But understanding didn't immediately equal healing. I still had 25 years of damage to work through. All those internalized messages about not being good enough, all that fear of abandonment and rejection that had followed me into my adult relationships. I knew I needed help processing all of this, but I also knew I wasn't ready to leave yet. There was still more work to do. Final update. I ended up staying in my hometown for almost 6 months, much longer than I'd originally planned. My employer was understanding about the extended leave, especially after I explained some of what I was dealing with. During that time, I not only helped my mother settle my father's affairs, but also worked on rebuilding our relationship. We'd both been casualties of my father's unresolved grief, and it took time to learn how to relate to each other outside of that dynamic. One of the most healing things I did was create a photo album that told the complete story of our family, starting with pictures of my father's first marriage and his son, then moving through the tragedy and his meeting my mother, then my birth and childhood, right up to the present. It was painful to put together, but it helped me see the narrative arc of our lives in a way that made sense. We weren't a broken family. We were a family that had been shaped by extraordinary circumstances. I also made peace with my father in a way I never thought would be possible. I started visiting his grave regularly, not to forgive him exactly, but to acknowledge the complexity of what had happened between us. I would sit there and tell him about my life, about the things I'd accomplished and the person I'd become despite everything. Sometimes I was angry, sometimes sad, sometimes just tired. But gradually, I found a kind of peace with the whole situation. The biggest surprise came when I was finally ready to return to my life across the country. My mother asked if she could come with me, not permanently, but for an extended visit. She said she'd spent so many years focused on managing the crisis of our family situation that she'd never really gotten to know me as an adult. She wanted to see the life I'd built, meet my friends, understand who I'd become when I was free to be myself. Having her visit was awkward at first. I'd been living independently for so long that having family in my space felt strange. But slowly, we started to build something new together. She met my friends and saw the respect I'd earned at work. She saw my apartment and my routines and the small but meaningful life I'd created for myself. For the first time, I felt like she was seeing me as my own person rather than as a casualation of our family's dysfunction. The conversation that changed everything happened on her last night visiting. We were sitting on my balcony, looking out at the city lights, and she suddenly started crying. When I asked what was wrong, she said she was crying because she was proud of me. Not proud in a patronizing way, but genuinely impressed by the man I'd become despite having so few advantages. She said she'd spent years worrying that the damage from my childhood was irreversible, but seeing my life had convinced her that I'd somehow managed to heal myself in ways she'd never imagined possible. That's when I told her something I'd never admitted to anyone, that for most of my adult life, I'd felt like I was playing a role, pretending to be confident and successful, while inside I still felt like that 16-year-old kid who'd been told he was a family shame. But over the past months, working through the truth about my father and his first son, I'd started to feel like maybe I actually was the person I'd been pretending to be. Maybe all those years of trying to prove my worth had actually resulted in me becoming worthy, even if I'd never gotten the validation I'd craved. When I returned to work after my extended leave, people commented on how different I seemed. More relaxed, more confident, less like I was constantly trying to prove something. I started dating again for the first time in years, and for the first time I felt like I could be vulnerable with someone without being terrified they'd discover I was fundamentally flawed and leave me. The relationship that developed surprised me with its ease and naturalness. I found myself able to trust in ways I'd never been able to before, able to believe that someone could love me without conditions or comparisons. When I eventually told her the whole story about my father and discovering the truth about his first son, she listened without judgment and then said something that stayed with me. That maybe the reason I was such a good partner was because I'd learned early how to be resilient and self-sufficient, but I'd also learned how much love and acceptance meant because I'd gone so long without them. A year later, my mother moved permanently to my city. She said she wanted to be closer to me, but I think she also wanted to start over somewhere that didn't hold so many painful memories. She found a small apartment about 20 minutes from mine, and we developed a routine of having dinner together once a week. It felt like getting to know each other for the first time, building a relationship based on who we actually were rather than who we'd been forced to be in that house full of grief and secrets. I still think about my father's first son sometimes, but not with the same confusion and pain as before. I've come to think of him almost like a guardian angel, someone whose brief life had such an impact that it shaped everything that came after. I don't believe in fate or destiny, but I do believe that sometimes terrible things happen that force people to become stronger than they ever thought possible. If that little boy hadn't died, I wouldn't exist. If my father hadn't been broken by grief, I might never have learned how to build my own strength. The strangest part of the whole experience was realizing that in some ways, my father's treatment of me had been a twisted form of love. Not healthy love, not the kind of love a child needs, but love nonetheless. He'd push me away because he couldn't bear to lose another son, and in doing so, he'd force me to become independent and resilient in ways that served me well as an adult. It doesn't excuse what he did, but it helps me understand that even broken people are capable of love, even if they don't know how to express it in healthy ways. Now, when people ask me about my childhood, I don't automatically launch into stories about how terrible my father was. Instead, I tell them about a family that was shaped by tragedy and grief, about how trauma can echo through generations in unexpected ways, and about how sometimes understanding the whole story can change everything. I tell them that healing isn't always about forgiveness or reconciliation. Sometimes it's just about understanding what really happened and making peace with the complexity of it all. The last entry in my father's journal, the one I found after reading everything else, was written just a month before he died. It was short, just a few lines, but they meant everything to me. He wrote that he'd been watching me from a distance for years, proud of what I'd accomplished, but unable to reach out because he knew he'd forfeited the right to be part of my life. He wrote that maybe his first son would have been proud to have me as a brother, and that maybe somewhere, somehow, they were both watching over me now. I keep that journal on my bookshelf now, next to photos of both my father's sons, the one he lost and the one he pushed away. We were both his children, both shaped by his love and his loss in different ways. Understanding that has given me a peace I never thought I'd find, and a sense of belonging in my own story that I'd been searching for my entire life.